Okay, so what we need to look at today is how we're going to go about actually getting these things to render out properly. Okay, now ideally it's very impractical to render everything out in camera, okay, which means rendering out your final image for the first time and for the last time as one image sequence. Okay, so what we'd rather do is have a lot more control. Okay, so the whole idea of compositing comes into play. Also, for the most part, all of our shots, we don't have moving cameras. So our backgrounds are static, okay? Unless there's moving objects in the backgrounds, which I don't think there are for many of us. So what we can do to also speed this process up a lot is render out our background separately as one still frame, and then render out our characters and their shadows and that kind of thing on a different layer or a different pass, so that we can basically go and overlay those two. So we don't have to render out a whole frame 800 times, however many frames we have. Okay, so we're going to look at how we're going to start setting that up today, and we'll finish setting that up on Thursday. Okay, so we can look at basically, we only had time to do the background in the previous class. So to render out a still frame of the background and look at all the different passes that we have available, and how we can go about basically getting the most control and the most flexibility that we may need, while taking render speed and that kind of thing into consideration. Okay, so also basically we're going to do this once we have already finished our lighting, finished our textures, finished our animation. Okay, so all of that's been done specifically so that when we do this, often we may want to save out a separate file for a certain thing. So say now our character's shadow pass, for instance, I'm just making an example, that we have a blend file which is set up specifically to render that out. Since some of the settings are different and it's a little bit easier just to do it in a separate file. So we don't want to do it while there's still animation changes that need to be done, or textures that we're tweaking, or lighting, or that kind of thing, because then we're going to be redoing a lot of things as well. Okay, so for now, we're basically just going to go through some of the settings in Blender before we need to render, how we can set up our scenes so that they render properly, all the different file formats, all the different layers and render passes and that kind of thing, and then render it out and see how we can go about using those passes to achieve different results. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to save this, and we're going to now basically first render out just a still frame of our background. Okay, so we're going to have a still frame of our background, and then on top of that we're going to render our character and his shadows and then we will composite all of those together. Okay, so I'm quite likely repeating a lot of what Sean's doing with you guys in the elective, but that's fine. Okay, so yeah, let's see. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to turn off everything I don't need. So I've got my character and his little car as a separate layer. I'm going to render out my character and his car as my character, okay, because those are the things that will be moving. So when the character is busy animating the car will be moving around and shaking and whatnot. So anything that the character is busy using, so if he's holding a pencil, or if he bumps into something, or if he throws anything, or if he has a crossbow, whatever it is, the things that the things he's directly interacting with, and those things, if they are moving specifically, those we all want to render out together as my character's pass. Okay, the things that are static, which is basically just my background, okay, so this we can render out one frame of. Okay, that makes sense. So obviously the things that are moving we need to render out with our character. Okay, or if it's a background object that's moving, we want to render that thing out on its own, and also comp that. Okay, so for instance, if this tree was busy blowing in the wind, I don't want to render out this entire frame just because that thing's busy blowing. I would basically go and render out everything without it, render that out as a separate pass. So that means I can render out my whole frame once, and that just is like a second character pass. Okay, so then I render out my tree with its shadows, stick that on top. Okay, and then my character with its shadow stick that on top. So we want to do it as efficiently as possible. You guys know how long things take to render. So we need to do absolutely everything we can to speed up our renders. Okay, so first things first. Let's go through some of our settings, literally going down the list over here. Okay, so starting over here in our main scenes render settings. Okay, first of all, if you have a computer that has a GPU that is at all useful, set your scene to render using the GPU and the CPU. So in your preferences, under System, over here, if you say CUDA, okay, you can set it to use your graphics card as well as your processor, okay, which will make things a bit faster, okay. So using the graphics card and the CPU isn't going to be as fast as rendering on your CPU plus the time it takes rendering on your GPU, okay? So it's not going to be twice as fast, or if you render, for instance, 3 minutes on one and 3 minutes on the other, it's not going to suddenly be 1.5 minutes. It'll be 2 minutes, okay? But it is worth the effort, okay? If you have incredibly complex scenes, sometimes your GPU will crash, okay, which makes it less useful, okay? That's why CPU rendering is still the preferred way to do things. CPU rendering is faster for certain things, but not all things, okay? So bear that in mind. I'm not sure, I'm not clever with these things, but as far as I'm aware, the amount of RAM or virtual RAM that your GPU has, if your scene needed more than that number of gigs of RAM to render on your CPU, then your GPU will crash. Okay, I think. I'm not sure, but that's how I understand it. Okay, so first of all, straight off the bat, set it over there and then there. Otherwise, just leave it on your CPU computer. Okay, the next thing I want you to look at is under the sampling tab. Okay, so under sampling, it should look like this. Okay, so we have 3 options over there, and the main 2 being the render and the viewport samples. Okay, so samples, as you guys are well aware, are these little grainy pixels that keep updating and changing. Okay, so every time the computer performs a calculation to render out your image, that, as I understand it, is a sample. Okay, so each time it calculates further and further and further, the more samples we have, the clearer and less grainy our image becomes. Okay, so generally speaking, we have 2, so that our viewport, so these dots over there that are getting refined and refined and refined, basically, like one way to think of it is that each pixel gets subdivided each time the sample takes place. Something like that. Again, don't quote me on that. I think my scene's volume is still on, so I need to turn that off. Okay, but we'll do that now. So we have separate settings for our render and for our viewport. If it is set to 0, like I have mine over here, it will render infinitely until 16,777,216 samples. Okay, this is over there. Okay, so there it's just going to keep rendering and keep getting smoother and smoother and smoother. That doesn't help for actual images because then we'll never get to the second image. Okay, so we do need to set a limit for our render samples. Now, generally speaking, 1,000 is great, but sometimes unrealistic in terms of the time it takes. Anything less than 500 or 600 is still going to be great. So somewhere in between 500 and 1,000, you're going to get somewhere where your image should be looking quite good. Okay, so if you can afford to render 1,000 samples, so if it's a background plane, for instance, put it on 1,000, wait the hour for it to render out, and you have a nice clean background plane. However, if you get away with less than that, obviously that's fine too. So don't be surprised if you have a very grainy render, if your render samples are less than 500, even less than 700 sometimes. So what you do is you put it on 500, you render out a frame, see what it looks like. If it's still grainy, bump up the samples. See what you can do. Okay, there are a bunch of settings that in 2.8 already set to optimize the renders quite a lot, which make them, well, render out pretty well. I mean, this is already at 39 samples, and it's grainy in the shadows and the volume, but I mean, some of the bits are actually quite acceptable. Makes it look like a shot in film. Okay, So that's something to be aware of. So for instance, I'm going to leave mine 128 for now. So just for this test, okay, so that it's not very high, but it's good enough that we can at least comp on it so long. Okay. What you can always do is render out a lower sample, the image, do all your compositing that you need to for your background, and then whenever you have time, tonight or tomorrow night, put on a nice high-res so I can just swap out the render image. Okay, moving down, still part of the sampling, there's this, oh, before we do that, this integrator setting, which is currently set to path tracing, you can set to branched path tracing. And what that does is it basically splits up your samples so that you have more control over each specific kind of array's samples. Okay, so the big one is normally volume. Okay, volume takes longer than any of the others because you're rendering out literally depth. Okay, so there's so much more to render out when it comes to volume than just the surface. Okay, so technically speaking, all your other objects that you're rendering are just a whole bunch of 2D planes which create a 3D shape. Okay, so you're not rendering out the volume of it, whereas the volume you're literally rendering out voxels. Okay, which takes obviously a lot longer. So for that reason, you can say, okay, I've got a very lot of like light rays and smoke and that kind of thing in my scene. So I want this to render out 10 times more volume rays than every other one. So then instead of setting your entire scene to render to 1,000 samples because just your volume needs it, where your diffuse samples don't need it, you can say render all of the other scenes out very low, but render a lot more on this, okay, which definitely does make things a lot slower if you don't do that. Okay, so if you have a lot of volume, just for instance over here, you'll see if I set this to 5, so it's trying to do this while I'm doing anything. Then at the bottom over here, you'll see they're still rendering only 128 samples for everything except for the volume. It's now rendering 640 samples. Okay, so that makes the whole frame will obviously take a lot longer, but a lot, if you count, for instance, the amount of total samples for all of those together, it's still significantly less than if all of them are rendering 640 samples. Okay, so be aware of that if you ever need to, specifically with volume, or if you have a lot of subsurf and there's noise in your subsurface scattering, you do the same for that. But other than that, you generally don't need it for any of the others, I don't think. Maybe a glossy rays, but I don't even think that's fair. Okay, I'm going to turn off my volume in any case. I'm not going to render out the volume here. I'm going to add it in post. Okay, so let's just pause that. We don't really need that to continue rendering while we're busy with this. Okay, it's decided to go and move that out. Okay, so moving down over there. So I'm actually just going to turn that back off. I'm going to leave that on just normal path tracing. Okay, so that's just for interesting. Over here we have the seed. Okay, so this literally determines the seed of the noise pattern that or your grain. Okay, now what you'll find is, I'm not sure if that's on or off. I think by default that little clock is on. So okay, what this does is your noise pattern will have a certain pattern to it. Okay, if this is off, okay, so that little clock over there isn't blue, it's going to basically have that same noise pattern for each frame. Okay, so what you'll notice is if you have a very grainy render, sometimes the grain changes on each frame and you get like flickering happening, okay, which is normal. So if you look at filmed footage, your grain changes on each frame. Okay, whereas if you have this off, that grain pattern is going to stay the same. Now sometimes it looks better if you have very grainy things. Often it doesn't. Okay, it looks a little bit more fake. So turning that icon on, which it is by default, varies that noise pattern on each frame. So it varies the seed on each frame so that your grain changes. Okay, which is actually what you want. Okay, if you want to turn it off, you can. Okay. After that, the only thing, you don't really need to know or change any of the rest. They've already been set up for you. Specifically under this light path setting, okay, there's 2 or 3 settings here, actually 4, that since 2.8 I think have been set by default, which previously weren't. Specifically the indirect light clamping, your filter glossy on your caustics, and the actual activation of your caustics. Okay, now by default these are all off. However, there was something that you always had to go and set to speed up your renders and have less fireflies in your renders. Okay. Specifically, this indirect lighting one, okay, which is by default set to 10, which you can leave. Normally that was on 0. The filter glossy on your caustics was set to 0, which is now set to 1, which is fine. And then also your reflective and your refractive caustics are off. Okay. Now you guys all know what caustics are. So basically, when light shines through something, specifically like glass or water or reflective caustics where it bounces off of something that's very shiny, like chrome, you would get a light pattern on the floor. So if you think of a swimming pool, that light pattern you get on the floor, or a glass of water, there's a little light, interesting light pattern that you get. If you want those, you need to turn these on, but those take very long to process. That's why it's turned off by default. And generally speaking, it's something that you don't always need in your scenes. Okay, so unless it is a shot of a glass of water and you want that light pattern on the floor, or a swimming pool, or whatever, and you don't want to cheat it and want to render it out accurately, then you only need to throw those on. Okay. Other than that, in your sampling, with that section of the samples, you don't really need to set anything else. The next thing is really just here under the Film tab to do with transparency. Okay, so if you're rendering out specifically our characters, where we only want the character and then transparent pixels for the rest of the frame so that we can put it on top of our background, we do need to tell it that those pixels need to be transparent. Okay, so, or if we have a background and the sky, we're going to replace the image in post or whatever it is, we do need to turn on under the Film tab transparent as well as the transparent glass. Okay, so just turn them on always, keep them on. It's just better to have them on, even if you're not using them. Okay. Other than that, you really don't need to do much. If you want to change your tile size, you can. You don't really need to. If you're rendering only with your GPU, which no one does anymore, then you would generally make these a little bit bigger. However, they're fine. Okay, so that is everything under there, I think. Okay, under color management, you can go and play with those as well, but you can also just leave it. Okay. So if you want to render out filmic, I think it's by default is on filmic. If you want to go and render anything else, you can go and set it. I just render out the way it is, specifically for this kind of thing. Okay, next one is our output dimensions and stuff. Okay, so you guys are very aware of where you set your frame size. Okay, I'm going to render out a full frame this time. So you're starting your end frames. So here we're only going to render out one frame, so it doesn't really matter. We're not going to render a sequence. But what is important is this output section. Okay, so for our backgrounds, okay, so we'll go through this again later when we do the characters, but just for our backgrounds specifically, we do need to go and set where we want to save it. So I have a render folder somewhere, my final renders, and then a folder for just the environment stuff, and then I've just called it background main with underscore. Okay, these next bunch of check blocks, overwrite basically will, if it's turned on, regardless of what is currently in that render location, it will render your image. Okay. You want to turn this off if you, say now, are rendering on more than one computer. Okay. So, for instance, you're rendering a whole sequence on 10 computers. If this is off, it's basically going to skip any files that already exist in that folder. Okay. And then render one that doesn't exist yet. Okay. If that is the case, then you also need to turn on placeholders. What placeholders does is, well, without it, normally Blender only saves a file once it has finished rendering your frame. Okay. Now you can imagine if it did that while rendering on 10 computers, then even though another computer is busy rendering that file, it doesn't exist yet. So then the next computer is going to also render that file. So that doesn't work. So what placeholders does is that when it starts rendering your file, it saves like a placeholder file. So it basically books that frame and says, I'm busy rendering this frame, don't you render it? And then other computers will skip those and go to the next ones. Okay, so by default, I normally have that off and that on. Okay, if you are re-rendering something, so you have already rendered it, but you need to render it again, what often happens is this is off and then it doesn't want to render, and that's because that's off. Okay, so if you deliberately want to override what currently is there, then you need to reactivate that. Always have file extensions on. Okay, I don't know why you'd want to turn that off. Cache result, I don't think is. It saves it. It'll cache it, so it'll save it to the RAM. I don't see why that's necessary. Goodness.
Do you have a fight with a lawnmower?
Cache result. So I mean, yeah, I don't think that's necessary. So for this, what we want to do, file format specifically. Okay. If you are going to composite anything, okay, and you want more than just the final result, which is what we do, then you need to render out a file format which contains all of your render information in one file. Okay, so what used to be the case was that we'd have to render out individual images for each frame of each pass that we wanted. Now it saves it all in one file, which makes everything a lot easier. It just makes it potentially a little bit slower since you're working with larger files in the end. Okay, but specifically now when we're just doing our background, we definitely want to render out all of our passes as one image. Okay, so we're using OpenEXR multi-layer images. Okay, so that's very important. Okay, RGBA so that we have our alpha channel. You don't need to change the color depth. Leaving it on float full is ideal. And then another thing which is very cool, which is new, is that you can turn on preview, which basically saves out a JPEG of your frame as well. Okay, that's very nifty when you are rendering these files. I mean, these files can get massive. Okay, like hundreds of megs per frame. Which, if you imagine, you just want to check your render to see if it actually worked, and you just want to watch through the sequence. That becomes cumbersome to work with. So using or saving a JPEG version of each image as well it's really just useful. So you have previews of everything as well. Then metadata. You guys have all worked with metadata before. What I like to do sometimes is I render out a slightly bigger image than what I need. Okay. Deliberately, so I'm aware of it. So I'll render out either, if I'm working at a not 16 by 9, I'll still render out 16 by 9 because it gives you some play to like re-rack the shots afterwards or whatever, but it also allows you to burn your metadata into your frame. Okay, now it sounds counterintuitive because why would you want to have text on your actual images? What happens a lot is that you have rendered out your sequence and then next week there's a glitch and you need to go and re-render that specific shot and that specific scene. But you have no idea where the blend file was where that frame came from. So this frame there's a glitch on and you need to render out this frame again. Having literally just the file name of the blend file which it came from burnt into it means you're never going to have that issue. Okay, so that's very useful. So I'll generally render out a 16 by 9 image, have that on, which will then be in the corner somewhere. We're never actually going to see it, and it's going to be cropped out in any case. And then you always know. Okay, so just be aware that if you do that, you do need to render out a larger frame than what you need. Okay. What I also do is for a lot of stuff, I render out 2K, even though it's HD, so 1920, which then does the same thing. Okay, and that is all over there. Then if we go down to this next section where we have all of our passes. Okay, so for this example, I'm literally going to render out all of, or save all of them. Okay, just to go through, well, we'll go through what they are in the actual render. Okay, so I've literally turned on everything over here. I'm also going to turn on denoising because this saves out your unnoised or your noised, your undenoised, that doesn't make sense, your noisy image as well. Okay, so we can see what effect that actually has. It will inevitably make it a little bit slower, but since you're rendering through samples, you should save time. Be aware denoising is not as great as what you may think. It is very useful, but you still need a lot of samples. So it takes your lot of samples and makes it a little bit better. It's not going to take a really bad sample image and make that better because it will make it flicker.
The next denoiser instead.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Then anyway, so let's F12 that and see what this all looks like. Yeah. Okay, so that's just gonna take a while to think, and then we can go through sticking all of this together. Yeah, this will only work obviously if your background doesn't change. So if you don't have camera movement or you can't isolate entire sections of it, you know, which is really useful. You need to know how to do this. I mean, at some point you're going to have a night to render out a whole thing, and the only way you're going to do it is if you render out a still background and move it in post or whatever. So yeah. So a lot of you, I mean, I don't think there's almost anyone who has, or who entirely can't do this for the CAD projects. I think everyone has static shots in any case. Or if you're really crazy, you can bake out all your textures and your lighting. And then that'll take longer than just rendering out the whole sequence.
I'm using EXR. Just color space.
And so that all the,
Bosses are in one file.
yeah. Where's your dad doing so these days? Even if I'm not rendering multi-layers, I still render these days.
No, but EXR next to it.
Oh, here, because then we have all the
Color space is better, so.
and then you have your depth and your mist and all the passes and everything there. And specifically, I mean, just for this, it's good to know. I think I may stop this and just render out a half one, because this is definitely going to take another 25 minutes. Okay, guys. Peter, hey, I just shouted at all of you and you still keep on shouting. You have a tendency to talk very loudly, and that makes everyone else talk loudly as well.
Inside witnesses.
Okay, let's try that again. This should take much quicker. So rendering out just a half res one, because otherwise it'll take too long. How do you?
How do you apply the lights into the package? Just rendering something. Separate the background from the package.
Yeah.
So that you just keep the lights that have selectively render. So
We're going to go through that. Thanks. We're going to do it on Thursday. Okay, so that went a lot quicker. It's crazy how just a full res thing would have taken 25 minutes. The same samples, a half res thing takes 2 minutes. Makes no sense, but still. Okay, so there I think I literally have 2 doors on top of each other, and there all my doors are freaking out, but I have no idea why. Anyway. Okay, so this is almost done. So the only real things that I want to do here, okay, is things that you could do in camera. since it's a still frame, but on the odd chance that you would want to render out a camera move or whatever, then this counts as well. Okay, so this is now saved into, I presume, the RAM. It's now done what I've done in the previous class on top of this. But let me just show you. There, okay. If you close that and want to get it back, you press F11, which will then open it up again. Okay, so that goes over there and says view render, okay, which is then saved. Okay, so the things you want to do is we want to add, first of all, our depth of field, okay, so we don't have to render that out. Okay, so by using the depth layer and then the actual camera that is still in the scene, we can then go and specify our depth of field. Okay, I also want to add, instead of the mist that we would have rendered out, which would have taken forever, we can use the mist layer and composite that in. Okay, and then show you a nifty trick to say now there was something that you wanted to go and adjust or tweak, that we can change that as well. But also, while we're doing it, we can quickly just look at what all the passes are. Okay, so this is all that we're going to be doing, so let's just delete all of that. Okay, so there is my image. Okay, so I just quickly want to go and jump through. You can see all the passes that are saved. Okay, if we were to save this image as an actual file, you'd see how big it actually is. Okay, so it's I don't know, many megabytes. But let's just quickly look. Okay, so the image is obviously what it was. This is the alpha, which there is none because our whole frame is full of geometry. Okay, the depth doesn't look like anything there, but if we go and just tweak it a little bit, you can see what it actually looks like. So if we add a math node and set that to power, you can see there we slowly get some detail back. Okay, so this is basically what we use to create our depth of field. So each pixel has a value from 0 to 1, which basically 0 is the furthest away and 1 would be the closest to the camera. Okay, using your normal pass, okay, over here you have normals, okay, which I've never really, I think I've used normals in post once ever, but you can do crazy lighting things and stuff if you really need to. UVs, however, are very useful. You can literally go and retexture something using your UV channel. Okay, so say now you had a flag in your scene, and by the end of your project there's been a revolution and there's a new flag for that country, you don't want to render out your whole movie again. You can literally go and swap out that image using basically this, as well as your, for instance, diffuse color. Okay, so you would basically go and take this image, which is the color channels of all of your objects without any lighting. So this is just color information, and you would use your UV layer and apply a new image to something using then an object mask, and then overlay that on this, and then apply your color back or your lighting back on top of it. So you can literally go and retexture your entire scene to a certain degree. I wouldn't, but it's possible. So it makes more things change if you really need to. In a pinch, you can do that. Okay, so that was your UVs. Your vectors won't do anything here because there's no movement. Okay, so vector, if there was movement, you would see some weird green blurs. So for our characters, you would be using that to create your motion blur. Okay, shadows, you can extract your shadows from this. However, I've never found that this is a particularly useful layer. And rendering out shadows separately, like we're going to be doing with our characters in any case, is better. Okay, ambient occlusion, we can go and boost the occlusion if we wanted to. Index objects and index materials are basically the old versions of cryptomats. Okay, so basically you could assign beforehand individual objects with a number. Okay, so you can say all your trees and your light fixture you want to go and adjust in post. So we'd say their index object number is 1, and then you would use the little node over here and select 1 as your index object, and then any objects with that number assigned to it would then be selected as a mat. Okay, as I'm saying, I don't think I couldn't even find the setting just now where you would actually set it. Okay, so I'll show you now what the new replacement of that is. Mist is what we would then be using to create our atmospheric perspective. So basically little particles in the air, and air pollution, or all of that make the further objects seem misty. There we go. Okay, our emit layer would be any objects that had emission materials on, would then come up over here. Environment, those are actually holes in my floor, and you see the environment behind this. Okay, so if you had an HDRI map, whatever, that would then be over here. Then, using our diffuse, our direct diffuse, our indirect diffuse, and our diffuse color, you can basically go and recreate your diffuse channel. I can't remember exactly, but you go and multiply and add and divide those three together to get your diffuse channel, and then you can do the same for all your glossy surfaces, and you can do the same for all your transmissive surfaces, and you can do the same for all your subsurface surfaces, and that way literally go and recreate this layer, but then you can literally go and say, okay, all my reflections are a little bit too bright, so you can drop those a little bit. Or your subsurface objects are a little bit. So you can have a lot of control if you need it, but generally speaking, for our purposes, it's a little overkill. Okay, but it is possible. There's a tutorial somewhere on YouTube where they literally go through how to reconstruct or how to compile those to get this image. Okay, so I'm just saying it so that you know about it. Okay, this debug render time, this is very useful. This basically takes each tile that you had and assigns a color to it based on how long it took to render. Okay, and I'm assuming that the lighter the color, the longer it took. Okay, so this way, if your renders are really taking long, you can go and see exactly what areas or what objects are causing your renders to take so long. So if you have, say, one object which is in the background, which is taking really long to render, and you can see that over here, then you can go and drop the subdivisions of that object or simplify the shader or whatever it is to make that spot render a little bit quicker. So this definitely helps just to see where your things are taking long. And why this is looking like this is because I think my volume, environment volume, was on a little bit, and that's why the objects further away took longer to render. Okay. Now, the cool thing that I wanted to show you is, and this also is totally overkill, but really nice to know. Okay, so specifically, it's good to be aware of it and potentially have it on, even if you're not going to use it, just in case someone comes back one day and say, that seagull over there is the wrong color, and it's this big in your frame, and doing anything else is going to be a nightmare. Okay, so this is called cryptomats. Okay, and what cryptomats are is basically a system where you can create a mask for any object in your scene. Okay, so previously what we had to do was go and say, okay, I'm probably going to need to tweak those objects, or in post, I need to go and render out individual masks for my seagulls, or whatever it is, which really took long. You could capture them, so that was more of a nuisance than anything else. All my wood is freaking out, which is bizarre. But anyway, how they work, and this is more, you don't need to do this, it's just useful information should you ever need to one day. If you take a cryptomat node, you can then go and say, okay, I'm going to do this by, as you can see over here, we had the option of turning it on for objects, materials, or assets. Okay, objects are specifically objects. Materials would be all objects with the same material, and then assets would be things that have been parented to like a group of objects. So for instance, all my windows are parented to their window sills. So if I go and look at it that way, if you connect your 3 cryptomat layers and connect your image, Okay, if you just look at it, it looks like nothing. If you look at the matte, it also looks like nothing, and that's because you haven't selected any objects. But if you look at this pick layer, you can see that each object has now got a different color. And now what you can do is you can say, I want to change the color of that window. So what it does is it creates a mask for that window. Okay, which is very useful because then you can say, okay, well, now I can go and say change the saturation or the hue or whatever of that window using that specific mask. Okay, so now I can say, window, you're not bright enough. Let's make you a lot brighter or more saturated or a totally different color, which is incredibly powerful. If we want to do it for all of our windows, then we say add that window. Sorry, it needs to be on the pick layer because it's literally picking the color. That window, add that window, and let's add that door at the back. Incredibly useful. Okay, really powerful. Okay, and that's pretty new. That's they only released. I don't think it was even in 2.79. I think that was a 2.8 beta thing that came out earlier this year, which is phenomenal. Okay, so know that it exists because one day you are going to need it. Okay, so if you are rendering out multi-layers, just turn those on so that you have the option to use them should you need to. Okay, however, all of that is extra. We're not really going to do anything with it. After that, I just quickly want to look at okay, so there's our noisy image. We still have that, so should we need it if we don't like what the denoiser had done, and then the stuff that it used to create our clean image, okay, which is that one. Okay, so just know that they're all there. You could probably go and find tutorials on how to go and use those to fix things should you need to, or whatever. If there were specific objects only that needed to be noised, then you can use those and a mask to go and change that. That name sounds familiar. Anyway, cool. So what we need to do is none of that. That's all just interesting stuff. What we need to do is we need to add in our depth and our environment atmospheric perspective. Okay, so let's all of this, as you know, with node-based compositing, you basically add one thing on top of the other. So I'm first going to add my atmospheric perspective because that also obviously needs to blur. So it doesn't help me adding it after I've blurred my image. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to take a color mix node, which is one of the main nodes that you use in your compositor. I'm going to take my image and my mist, and I'm going to connect those two and look what that does. Okay, so currently it is mixing between the two, so this just lets you pick which one you want to use. So we don't want to mix between the two, we literally want to add the one to the other. Okay, so we're going to set this to either add or screen or lighten or any one of these additive color space options. So if you say add, okay, you can see what it's done there, is the difference between add and screen is add kind of increases the value of the original pixels behind it, kind of like blends them, whereas screen basically just takes away the darker ones. Okay, so depending on what effect you want, if you really want to do something like that, then it's fine, you know, or lighten or whatever, but you can go and play with these until you find the one that works. I generally find with atmospheric perspective that add works really well. Okay, now the other thing is if we don't want it to be this color, we can go and tint it. So we can use another mix node, okay, on my mist. Okay, so here we can say instead of mix, we can also say multiply. And here we can go and say, okay, I want green fog everywhere, or whatever color it is that we want. So if we want it to be slightly warmer, we can do that, okay? Obviously I don't want it that strong. So I'm going to drop it to very subtle levels. Basically just something like that. Okay, just so that the things further back in my frame get a little bit hazy. Okay, so difference between that and that is what we have. Okay, which definitely makes a big difference. Okay, very subtle, but looks cool. This costs 0 in render time. The box in your scene costs 2 hours in render time. The box is prettier, ultimately, but it takes forever. Especially if you want like crisp, clean renders. Okay, so rendering it out so that it would look like this would take hours per frame. Whereas comping it in, this mist layer isn't rendered. It's calculated in some other way, so it's perfectly clear. Okay, anyway, so that is that. Okay, this, however, if you had like volumetric shadows and stuff, so if you literally had shadows being cast in your mist, obviously you're not going to get that. Okay, so this is a cheap but a pretty good one. Okay, then for our depth of field, all we need is a defocus node, okay, and now we're literally using the output of that for our image, okay, so that goes in there. The Z is our depth that we need, okay, so that goes in there. So immediately everything blurs out, which is what this does, okay, mostly because we haven't set it yet. So there are a couple of things we need to set. The first thing is we need to say use Z buffer, okay, which basically says use the depth setting of my camera in the scene that you select over here, which is that one, for your focal distance. Okay, so now it's currently set to f-stop of 128, which if you read what it says there is perfectly in focus. So everything's going to be in focus, like Ansel Adams. Okay, so we don't want that, so let's set it down to say, I don't know, 16. Okay, so there we're going to get a very blurry image, maybe 32, and there you can see over there more blurred than over here. Okay, now the preview option is still on, okay, so you can see what difference that makes. So the preview option makes it a lot quicker. This is quite a slow node, but you definitely want to turn it off for your final exports. And you can, if you find that's still too much, you can play with the rest of the settings. You can limit the maximum amount of blur, so you can make it 2 or 3 or whatever. Okay, so it just blurs a little bit there and less over here. Or it kind of clamps it. I'm not sure if it actually does clamp it or if it just adjusts everything. And then this gamma correction, it kind of boosts the highlights a little bit, which it says correction, so it kind of makes sense that it would need it. I find it looks better with it on, generally speaking, in any case. Okay, and that, for my background, is as far as I can take that without my character in there. Okay, so basically once you have set this up, okay, what is nice to do is just to save this image as an actual file, rather than just using the image saved in your Blender scene. Okay, so if you press F11 and go back to this image and say save as, you can then save that original image with all of its data and everything, and just go and swap out this render layer so that when we add our character to this on Thursday, we have our background all rendered out and ready to go, and we can literally just go and drop in our character on top of that. Okay, so there I've already saved mine out. Just make sure you save it still as the same settings, and then you just bring it back in as a input image. Go and open this. Okay, there that is. And then you just need to change one setting on it to actually get all your layers back. So you need to say there, new layer, and you'll get all your render layers. Okay, so there it's actually saved into an image. Okay, so there you can just go and swap all of these inputs with these ones, so that when we go and render out a final thing, it renders that every time instead of your actual scene. Cool. Okay, see you guys on Thursday.